December 1944. The Ardennes forest is buried under ice and snow, a frozen trap for anyone who dares move through it. The wind howls like the guns that have already burned these woods to silence. American tanks are stalled, soldiers shivering in foxholes, their faces pale and tense. Every breath fogs in the bitter air. Across the line, German soldiers crouch, confident in their experience. They've faced Patton before. They know the roar of his tanks. They've learned the rhythm: armor first, infantry follows. Survival, they believe, is predictable. But tonight, nothing is predictable. Something moves in the shadows, quiet, relentless, invisible to the enemy's eyes. Small teams advance where tanks cannot, striking with precision. The men are underestimated, overlooked, sent to the front lines when the world told them they were not ready. And yet the Wehrmacht trembles. Reports later call them fearless, unstoppable, unlike anything we have seen. Patton's deadliest weapon is not a tank, not artillery, not firepower. It is his black soldiers. On this frozen battlefield, the fear they inspire will turn the tide. Because history often remembers the machines, but in this moment, it is courage, raw, relentless, and refused by prejudice, that becomes the ultimate weapon. The stage is set. The enemy doesn't yet know what's coming. In late 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had stretched into a grinding campaign. The Normandy landings of June had succeeded, but the months that followed were punishing. Supply lines lengthened, German resistance stiffened, and winter brought mud, ice, and exhaustion to every front. Patton's Third Army, celebrated for its rapid thrusts across France, now faced an unforgiving reality. Tanks could only do so much, and the war was becoming a battle of men, not machines. Within the US Army, the question of manpower was urgent. The military remained segregated, a reflection of American society at the time. Black soldiers were largely assigned to labor, supply, and service roles. They built roads, unloaded trucks, repaired vehicles, but were rarely seen in frontline combat. The prevailing belief among senior officers was that black troops lacked the aggressiveness necessary for offensive engagements. This was a military doctrine shaped more by prejudice than evidence. Yet the battlefield had little patience for prejudice. Casualties mounted, and replacements were scarce. Patton, always pragmatic and driven by results, began quietly evaluating units that could fight where others faltered. Reports trickled in of black infantry volunteers who had trained rigorously in segregated units, hunting marksmanship, small unit tactics, and endurance under harsh conditions. They were disciplined, determined, and ready. Across the lines, Germany was under pressure too. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin. The Ardennes, while intended as a staging ground for a counteroffensive, was defended by weary men, many of whom had fought continuously since the Eastern Front or the Atlantic Wall. Their intelligence reports noted every new development in Allied troop composition, yet the idea of black Americans at the front remained underestimated until it was too late. Patton's solution was simple, if unconventional: deploy these volunteers to combat zones where the stakes were highest. They would operate in small, mobile teams, often in sectors considered secondary by traditional command, yet critical to the fluidity of the front line. It was a calculated risk, one that would challenge both military convention and the racial assumptions embedded in the US Army itself. The stage was set for a collision of prejudice, necessity, and battlefield reality. The men stepping into this role were aware they faced more than just enemy fire. They carried the weight of skepticism from their own army and the burden of proving their courage in the eyes of both friend and foe. Even before they crossed the line into enemy territory, the psychological game had begun. And on the German side, scouts and observers would soon notice patterns that could not be ignored. A small, highly effective, relentless fighting force, operating in sectors where tanks could not go, striking terror into seasoned troops. This was not the story of machines. It was the story of men tested against prejudice, terrain, and a desperate enemy. And it would redefine what the US Army and Germany understood about fear in war. By December 1944, the European front was at a critical juncture. The Allies had liberated much of France and Belgium, but the German army was far from defeated. In the Ardennes, Dense forests and snow-choked roads created a treacherous battlefield, perfect for surprise attacks. It was here that Hitler launched his last major offensive, the Ardennes counterattack, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. The surprise assault sent shockwaves through Allied lines. Units were encircled, supply lines severed, and panic rippled through both soldiers and commanders. Patton's Third Army was called upon to respond with speed and precision, but even he recognized the limitations of conventional forces in this frozen, chaotic terrain. The United States faced a manpower crisis. Casualties from Normandy, Operation Market Garden, and months of continuous combat had left divisions under strength. Reinforcements were arriving slowly, and the army had to make hard choices about how to allocate soldiers where they were needed most. It was against this backdrop that commanders revisited assumptions long held about black troops. Though the official military doctrine still relegated them to support roles, desperation created space for experimentation. Eisenhower, facing pressure from multiple fronts, approved the deployment of black infantry volunteers to certain high-stakes sectors. These were men who had already proven their competence in segregated units, disciplined, well-trained, and ready to fight. They were integrated into platoons attached to white units or sent in specialized teams capable of rapid maneuver. The objective was clear: reinforce faltering lines, plug gaps where tanks could not reach, and exploit areas of German weakness. For the men themselves, this was a double-edged sword. Combat offered the opportunity to prove their valor, yet it also placed them in extraordinary danger. Many understood that failure would be attributed not to circumstance, but to racial prejudice. Success, on the other hand, would remain largely invisible to the public eye. Recognition of black soldiers' achievements was often delayed or denied altogether. Meanwhile, German observers were already beginning to take note. Reports described small, fast-moving squads capable of striking hard, disappearing, and reappearing where least expected. The Wehrmacht had faced American soldiers before, but never like this. The quiet efficiency, aggression, and discipline of these black units began to unsettle even seasoned officers, creating a subtle but powerful psychological shift on the battlefield. By the end of December, the combination of strategic necessity and battlefield reality had produced an unprecedented deployment. Black soldiers were no longer confined to the sidelines. They were at the front, in places that demanded courage, precision, and resolve. And in doing so, they became a force that Germany had not anticipated and soon would come to fear. The conditions were now set for the first clashes that would cement this reputation, where courage, skill, and necessity converged in ways history had almost ignored. For the black soldiers sent to the front lines, combat was more than a test of skill. It was a fight for recognition, dignity, and equality. Many had enlisted with hope and determination, yet faced the stark reality of segregation within their own army. They carried rifles and grenades into the Ardennes, aware that the enemy in front was dangerous, but the prejudice behind them was equally formidable. Each engagement demanded not only physical courage, but emotional resilience. Letters home, diaries, and oral histories reveal men who understood that success could challenge long-held stereotypes, while failure could reinforce them. They were soldiers in the traditional sense, yet every step forward was a statement against societal assumptions that had followed them from American cities to the battlefields of Europe. General George S. Patton was a commander defined by results. Known for his rapid advances and aggressive tactics, he was not a man to adhere strictly to doctrine when it interfered with victory. Patton understood the limits of machinery and conventional thinking. He recognized that tanks could be stalled by mud or mines, artillery could be delayed by weather, and conventional infantry could be pinned by terrain or enemy fire. In deploying black soldiers to critical sectors, Patton demonstrated a rare pragmatism. These were men chosen not for politics, but for ability and reliability. In a winter that tested every commander's judgment, Patton's willingness to break precedent became a tactical advantage. He understood that the true weapon of war was not always steel, but people willing and able to act where others could not. German soldiers and officers were well trained and experienced, yet they had little precedent for facing these units. Initial reconnaissance noted unusual aggression in small American squads operating independently or ahead of main forces. Reports described men moving quietly, striking decisively, and retreating before counterattacks could materialize. To the Wehrmacht, these encounters were disorienting. Units that were supposed to be predictable, conventional targets were suddenly proving lethal. Fear in warfare is often invisible but contagious. As officers relayed reports up the chain of command, the psychological impact grew. Small successes by black soldiers at the front lines undermined confidence, disrupted planning, and created hesitation, an advantage that machines alone could never achieve. On the frozen Ardennes battlefields, mobility and precision were often more valuable than sheer firepower. Black soldiers were deployed in small, specialized teams, capable of maneuvering through dense forests and snow-clogged roads where tanks and artillery struggled. Their training emphasized marksmanship, stealth, and rapid assaults on weak points in German lines. These units frequently operated ahead of main forces, securing bridges, clearing roadblocks, or disrupting supply convoys. Tactical reports later noted that their actions often created openings for larger units to exploit, turning moments of desperation into opportunities. By combining discipline with audacity, these soldiers demonstrated that effectiveness in combat was not dictated by size or recognition, but by skill, coordination, and resolve. The men fighting at the front faced extraordinary danger, compounded by the knowledge that their heroism would often go unrecorded. Casualties were high, and black soldiers were sometimes placed in the most hazardous sectors precisely because their contributions were considered supplemental. Yet they persisted. Letters, memoirs, and interviews reveal a sense of purpose that transcended personal safety. They were fighting not just for victory over Germany, but for validation of their place in the U.S. Army and in history itself. This dual burden, combat plus social prejudice, added a profound moral dimension to their courage. Each successful engagement challenged assumptions about capability, resilience, and loyalty, leaving a quiet yet indelible mark on the war. Despite their impact, these soldiers' contributions were often marginalized in historical accounts. Military records, when preserved, rarely emphasized their combat effectiveness, focusing instead on conventional units or hardware. For decades, historians overlooked the psychological effect these men had on German forces and the way their presence shifted tactical calculations on the battlefield. Recognition came slowly, if at all, with many surviving veterans recounting how their service was ignored in official ceremonies and reports. The historical erasure highlights a broader truth. History frequently remembers the visible, tanks, guns, generals, but sometimes neglects the human elements that decisively shape outcomes. December 23, 1944. The Ardennes lay blanketed in snow, roads clogged, and visibility reduced to a few dozen meters. Patton's Third Army was racing to relieve surrounded units in Bastogne, but the frozen terrain slowed even the fastest armored columns. In the midst of this, small black infantry teams were sent forward into sectors where German defenses were weakest, but still lethal. Their first engagements were swift, surgical, and unnerving. Patrols moved silently through tree lines, eliminating sentries and securing key roadways that armored divisions would soon follow. German reports, preserved in captured documents, described these units as remarkably aggressive and unpredictable. Soldiers who had faced countless American attacks now found themselves disoriented by opponents who combined stealth with precision. One platoon, attached to a white infantry regiment, advanced ahead of the main column, clearing a series of crossroads critical for resupply convoys. Enemy observers noted confusion among German units. The Americans strike suddenly, vanish, and return where least expected, one officer recorded. Their resolve is unlike anything we have encountered. In addition to tactical effectiveness, the psychological impact was immediate. Units that had been holding firm began to falter when confronted with these squads. The Germans, conditioned to expect tanks, artillery, and conventional infantry, found themselves facing a threat that was invisible until it struck. Patrols, ambushes, and counterattacks revealed a pattern of relentless efficiency, striking fear into enemy troops. By late December, The reputation of these soldiers had begun to spread along the German lines. Commanders issued warnings, troops hesitated, and morale wavered. The small teams had become a force multiplier, capable of reshaping the battlefield not through numbers or machinery, but through skill, courage, and audacity. The stage was set for a broader demonstration of their power, one that would leave an enduring mark on both sides of the conflict. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was reaching a critical juncture. Patton's forces were closing in on Bastogne, and the German army, already strained by fuel shortages and attrition, faced relentless pressure. In multiple sectors, small black infantry teams continued to operate ahead of main columns, carrying out reconnaissance, ambushes, and targeted assaults on supply lines. Their actions were increasingly decisive. In one instance, a platoon advanced along a snow-choked road toward a key crossroads. German forces, expecting a routine reconnaissance patrol, were met with precise, coordinated fire. Several machine gun nests were neutralized within minutes. Reports from German officers described a mix of disbelief and terror. The Americans move like ghosts. They strike hard, vanish, and strike again where they are least expected. We cannot predict them. These engagements were not isolated. Across the Ardennes, similar operations by black units created confusion and hesitation among enemy troops. Tanks and artillery, once the primary source of fear, were circumvented or rendered ineffective by maneuverable, highly disciplined infantry. Commanders found themselves reassessing strategy in real time, reacting to a threat they had not anticipated. The psychological effect was profound. Even well-trained German troops faltered when these small units struck with speed and precision. Casualty reports reflected both the danger and the success of these operations. Losses were high, yet objectives were achieved repeatedly. The presence of black soldiers in frontline roles had shifted the battlefield dynamic. Where German commanders had once counted on predictable American tactics, they now encountered unpredictability and courage combined, an intangible yet decisive factor. By mid-January, the fear these men inspired had solidified. German officers began issuing specific warnings about them. Orders circulated to avoid direct engagement when possible, and anecdotal reports noted hesitation and retreat in areas where they operated. The Ardennes had become not just a test of strategy and machinery, but a proving ground for courage, skill, and the breaking of long-held assumptions. In this crucible, the reputation of Patton's black soldiers was forged. Their actions did not merely supplement the war effort, they reshaped it, demonstrating that fear in battle is not measured in tanks or artillery alone, but in the resolve of those willing to confront danger head-on, regardless of prejudice or expectation. By February 1945, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed. German forces were retreating, exhausted and demoralized, while Patton's Third Army pressed forward. The contributions of black soldiers, though often unheralded at the time, had played a critical role in securing key positions, reopening supply routes, and maintaining momentum where conventional units struggled. Small platoons, having endured frostbite, artillery fire, and ambushes, had repeatedly proven their tactical value under the harshest conditions. Despite their effectiveness, official recognition was limited. Reports often credited entire regiments or divisions, glossing over the specific achievements of black units at the front. In some cases, after-action reports described unknown small squads or advanced patrols, failing to mention the men's racial identity. Yet within German records, their impact was unmistakable. Field reports and officer diaries from the Ardennes repeatedly mention encounters with American infantry whose discipline and aggression exceeded expectation and inspired caution and fear among seasoned troops. Even without public acknowledgement, the enemy's fear confirmed their effectiveness. Casualty figures, where recorded, tell a sobering story. These men fought in some of the deadliest sectors, often assigned to the most difficult objectives because they were considered expendable by the segregated command structure. Many were killed or wounded, their sacrifice absorbed into broader statistics. Their courage, however, created a ripple effect. German hesitation, disrupted communications, and localized breakthroughs that allowed armored divisions and artillery units to advance. In essence, They were force multipliers, small in number but disproportionately influential in outcome. By spring 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, the broader military establishment began to take note of black soldiers' contributions, but acknowledgement was slow and often muted. While Patton himself praised effectiveness in private communications, public recognition remained limited, and the historical record would take decades to catch up. Yet in the immediate aftermath of winter combat, their legacy was already tangible. They had changed the dynamics of frontline engagement, proven indispensable in crisis, and earned the grudging respect of both friends and foes alike. The stage was now set for understanding the longer-term consequences of their service, both for the men themselves and for the U.S. military as a whole. As the war drew to a close in May 1945, the contributions of black soldiers in Patton's Third Army remained largely invisible to the public. Victory parades celebrated tanks, generals, and conventional infantry, while the men who had faced the deadliest assignments quietly returned to segregated units or stateside duties. Military historians at the time, focused on strategy and hardware, rarely highlighted the impact of these platoons. Yet the evidence of their influence was undeniable. German units that had once held lines without hesitation had faltered, retreated, or avoided engagement entirely when confronted by small, disciplined squads of black infantry. Fear had become a weapon, and it had been wielded with extraordinary effect. In the years that followed, veterans' testimonies began to surface. Soldiers described the shock on German faces when a small unit moved with precision through snow, disabling positions, capturing prisoners, and then disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. These first-hand accounts, combined with preserved German intelligence reports, illustrated a stark reality. The men had altered tactical outcomes not through brute force, but through skill, audacity, and unflinching courage. The war's end also set the stage for social and institutional change. The undeniable effectiveness of black soldiers in combat helped bolster arguments for desegregation, even as formal recognition lagged. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, mandating the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces, was influenced in part by the demonstrated capabilities of these troops. The Ardennes and subsequent European campaigns had provided irrefutable evidence. Competence and bravery knew no color. Yet for decades, the story remained underreported. Unit citations, decorations, and official histories often minimized or overlooked the frontline roles black soldiers had played. Scholars and military analysts have only gradually pieced together their significance, drawing from battle reports, oral histories, and archival materials. What emerges is a portrait of soldiers who, despite systemic prejudice, fought with skill and courage that even seasoned German officers feared. Their actions forced a re-evaluation of military assumptions, proving that the human element could shape outcomes in ways that machines, weapons, and numbers alone could not. The Ardennes winter left scars on the landscape, on those who survived, and on the perception of what constitutes fear and respect in combat. Patton's black soldiers had faced extreme danger, proven indispensable, and remained largely uncelebrated, but their impact would ripple through military history, influencing strategy, integration, and the very understanding of courage in war. The battlefield lessons of December 1944 and January 1945, combined with the delayed acknowledgement of these men's service, now lead naturally to a broader reflection. What does this chapter reveal about fear, courage, and the way history remembers, or forgets, those who shape it? War often measures strength in tanks, artillery, and numbers, but the Ardennes winter of 1944-45 reminds us that the human spirit can be the most decisive weapon of all. Patton's black soldiers fought not just the German army, but a system that underestimated them at every turn. They carried rifles into the frozen forests, navigated snow-choked roads, and faced ambushes and artillery fire with relentless determination. Each action was a quiet defiance, a statement that courage and skill are not determined by skin color, social status, or preconceived notions. The fear they inspired in the Wehrmacht underscores a fundamental truth of combat. Psychological impact is as lethal as firepower. when small, disciplined teams move with purpose, when every decision is precise and unhesitating, even the most experienced enemy hesitates. In this case, fear was not accidental. It was earned through bravery, training, and an unwavering will to succeed. History often highlights generals, machines, and headline victories, but it is in moments like these, where unsung soldiers shape outcomes against impossible odds, that the essence of warfare becomes visible. The contributions of Patton's black soldiers challenge the conventional narrative of WWII, reminding us that heroism can be quiet, unrecognized, and still transformative. Their legacy extends beyond the battlefield. They helped pave the way for the desegregation of the U.S. military, demonstrating that valor cannot be segregated. They proved that determination, skill, and courage can overcome prejudice, even in the most harrowing circumstances. And they left an enduring lesson for history. Fear, respect, and influence are earned by action, not by expectation. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, amidst tanks, snow, and blood, a truth emerged that machines could never replicate. The weapon Germany feared most was not steel, not artillery. It was men who refused to be underestimated. Men who fought with precision, courage, and unyielding resolve. And in remembering them, we honor not just their victories, but the principle that in war, as in life, humanity itself can be the ultimate force.